Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile with a message for everyone paying big wireless way too much. Please, for the love of everything good in this world, stop. With Mint, you can get premium wireless for just $15 a month. Of course, if you enjoy overpaying, no judgments, but that's weird. Okay, one judgment. Anyway, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
Since taking office in January, Trump has changed his tariff policy more than 50 times, as any stable genius would. And that is starting to catch up to him. Yesterday, he blew up at a reporter because she asked him about a new nickname that's been making the rounds on Wall Street. They're calling him Taco, which is an acronym for Trump always chickens out. How does it feel to be on the other end of the nickname game? Not great, does it? The only thing that would make it worse is if somebody changed the lyrics to a song by his beloved Village People to drive it home.
Taco, taco man. I want to be a taco man. Taco, taco man. Yeah, I've got to be a taco.
Quiet Riot. Hello and welcome to Quiet Riot Sunday School, the mini tariff deal to our regular Thursday full fat agreement. I'm Kenny.
And I'm Alex. Hello, Kenny.
Hello, Alex. Fancy meeting you on this glorious morning.
Yeah, we decided to start mixing things up a little bit, get you more involved after the last editorial meeting. People pretty much demanded more Kenny content.
Oh, people, be careful what you wish for, people.
Yeah, exactly. They don't know you like we know you. We'll give them...
And actually,
we'll give them a couple of episodes and then they'll be begging us to take you off air.
It won't take 2 episodes. I give them a couple of minutes, mate. I really do. It's something I said, actually, this is for the listeners, really. It's something I said to Naomi and Alex a couple of times, is that when I take part in the full fat episode that you hear on a Thursday, usually, I feel like I'm walking into somebody's front room, almost as a perhaps not entirely invited guest, which is, I think you've said, as it should be. You know, the chemistry between you and Naomi is very well established.
No, you shouldn't feel like that ever, and you shouldn't worry ever, because I always edit you out.
And that, listeners, is the secret of great editing.
But no, the point being that people know and understand your voice now. We've done a year of this insane schedule while holding down full-time jobs, and basically mixing it up a little bit will allow us to have the occasional Sunday off. I think I'm having one off next week, so that will be amazing.
So we know that lots of you who listen to us religiously on a Sunday already subscribe to the show to help us keep things rolling along. But it's worth mentioning for the many new people who come to Quiet Riot every week that all of our content is free to everyone at the same time with no restrictions. We do rely on your generosity to make these shows, so please sign up if you can afford it from as little as $5 a month at coffee.com/quietriotpod. That's ko-fi/quietriotpod.
And what better time than payday when this show goes out? So if you have been listening for the last year and thinking, oh yeah, I really must get round to doing that, or if you have been listening for the last year and you think that you derive enough value to up your membership from the lowest tier to the middle or higher one, then log on to ko-fi.com/quietriotpod and you can do that.
Fabulous. And thank you again to all those of you who over the last year and a tiny bit have helped us keep the show on the road. So, Alex, what are we going to chat about today? Naomi's away, and given that, I thought we could do a chunky section on why Nick Clegg is the greatest prime minister we never had, and a veritable love god to boot.
You really are determined to make this the last episode you participate in.
I value my Saturday morning lie-ins more than you will ever know.
Yeah, so we won't be doing that. I mean, as mad as that sounds, it's a mere bagatelle compared to the latest developments over the Atlantic, where Trump's tariff war is in trouble again. Musk has exited the White House, pursued by questions around alleged drug use, and there's a whole world of free speech madness around the Harvard row. So it would seem rude not to at least acknowledge this week's installment of the wacky world of Taco Trump.
How could we not feast upon that political banquet of BAM pottery? And once we're sick in the stomach of Trump, I thought we could take a trip down memory lane in honour, if that be the word, of Royal Bank of Scotland, now NatWest, which has just returned to completely private ownership after the most infamous bailout of the 2008 financial crisis. It's a crisis that we're still paying for today.
Finally, we are a podcast that prides itself in tackling the big issues. So we must discuss Robert Jenrick's solo campaign to tackle the biggest issue of our times. No, not global instability, not radicalization, not inequality, not child poverty, not climate change. No, fare dodging.
Okay, let's crack on.
Let's.
First, then, to the United States, where the political theatre continues to defy genre, although tragicomedy would probably suffice as a label if you seek such a thing. It's been a bruising week for many of Donald Trump's sweeping tariffs. The US Court of International Trade blocked their implementation, deeming the method used to enact them unlawful. But within a day, a federal appeals court said the tariffs could stay in effect temporarily at least. So for now, Trump's tariff agenda remains pretty intact, if in flux, in an unfolding legal saga that seems destined for the Supreme Court, and which Trump said on Friday he was confident he would win. Yeah, don't say. It's an acid test of how far Trump can go in reshaping global trade based on his instinct and ideology. But the wrangling so far signals that not everyone, even Trump-appointed judges, is willing to indulge another round of tariff roulette. Meanwhile, Trump's on-off affair with Elon Musk reached a natural conclusion of sorts, for now at least, as Musk packed his bags and bid adieu with a golden key to the White House, a black eye, and allegations that he used ketamine, ecstasy, and shrooms while campaigning for Trump last year. I mean, you would, wouldn't you?
You know, it's not like I agree with everything the administration does. So it's like I agree with much of what the administration does, but we have differences of opinion. There are things that I don't entirely agree with. But it's difficult for me to bring that up in an interview because then it creates a bone of contention. So then I'm a little stuck in a bind where I'm like, well, I don't want to, speak out against the administration, but I don't want to. I also don't want to take responsibility for everything the administration is doing.
While all this was going on, Trump's administration was further fanning the flames of its cultural war in academia, and Harvard in particular. The White House continued its blistering attack on the university's funding and governance structures, suggesting its approach to diversity, endowment management, and academic independence made it a hotbed of unaccountable liberal elitism. Now, those are big words by Trump standards, which suggests that someone on his team has at least completed English Lit 1, though probably not at Harvard. So, just 3 examples from yet another week of eye-popping politics from over the pond. They share one unmistakable theme, though, the blurring of politics, power, and punishment. Let's take a deep breath and try to unpack it all and look at what it might mean for America's global standing, its democratic norms, and whether governing by vendetta is the new normal. Alex, can we start with the really serious issue, which is Musk's black eye? Who turns up to their last day at work with a black eye, except perhaps someone who got in a fight at the staff Christmas party and doesn't yet know that they've been sacked?
Yeah, well, actually, listeners may remember that we predicted Musk's exit on precisely this date more than 6 weeks ago, because we'd spotted the fact that if he stayed any longer, he would need proper security clearance. He was only exempted for that for 130 days. And we did say that he'd be going on the 31st.
Did you put any money on that, Alex? Did you?
No, I didn't, unfortunately.
No.
So this was always going to happen. And he had been reversing away from the Trump regime for some weeks now, I would say. Since the tariff stuff, I think that was the bit that broke the relationship, because obviously that is horrendous for someone with big companies that manufacture things.
Let's not kid ourselves, though. If Trump had wanted Musk to stay on beyond his 130 days, he would have found a way to ignore conventions and rules and get him in, keep him in as well, wouldn't he?
I guess so. Whether that would have attracted criticism at a time when Trump was cooling on Musk anyway.
Yeah.
And Musk was suffering just huge losses reputationally and also in his main companies, as it were. I think they were both looking for a date to end this, and it's quite convenient to take the opportunity. I don't think their relationship has gone where it should have gone. On the black eye, I find it quite amusing that, from a set of people who can't stop telling lies, he turned around and said, oh, it was my kid that punched me, which I fully believe, by the way, because you saw that little shit at the last Oval Office presser.
Rubbing his boogers on the desk.
Yeah, he's a bit of a nightmare, and rightly so. I mean,
I kind of like the idea that Musk is getting beaten up by his little kids.
but did you think that someone like that would go, oh, I was practicing for...
I was shark fishing.
Practicing for a no-holds-barred all-out fighting championship or something, or I was doing my judo with my instructor, something a bit butcher than my 3-year-old beat me up.
Wouldn't the world be a different place if Trump's kids had decided to smack him in the face when he deserved it, rather than just letting him run riot as well? So how much money has Musk saved as part of his Doge activities?
Well, he promised to slash federal government spending by $2 trillion when he came in, and he is only 1.86 trillion short of his target, and that is by his own inflated estimates, by the way. Incidentally, Trump's new tax bill that's being pushed through at the moment will add 2.3 trillion to US debt. So overall, they're adding 2 trillion to the bill.
Quelle surprise, eh? We know the game plan over there about how they're redistributing wealth.
Oh, yeah.
And I should never be surprised, but the figures, doesn't matter how many times we hear them, they always make me raise my eyebrows, and not in a good way.
You spoke to European Commission President von der Leyen. Did you discuss the 50% tariffs, and did you agree to move it?
She just called me, as you know, and she asked for an extension on the June 1st date. And she said she wants to get down to serious negotiation because I told you specifically, haven't I told anybody that would listen? They have to do that. And we had a very nice call, and I agreed to move it. I believe June 9th would be, July 9th would be the date. That was the date she requested. Could we move it from June 1st to July 9th? And I agreed to do that.
So on the tariff front then, what's the latest? Because Trump blinked again, didn't he?
There was this decision from a federal court saying, no, you can't do tariffs like this. It's not a lawful way to impose them, basically, which a lot of people had suspected.
Yeah.
That this kind of trade stuff you need congressional approval for. The next day, another court said, no, you can impose them, but temporarily. So I suspect this will be thrashed out, go to higher courts, whatever.
Yeah.
Global stability is certainly not helped by this daily hokey-cokey. But to a large extent, the court stuff rather obscured what happened earlier in the week, which was that Trump basically backslided on his threat to put 50% tariffs on the European Union, decided to say that he would extend negotiations with them to do a deal. So that, I think, is the more important story, and that is part of the reason why markets began to recover a little bit again, albeit briefly, before he does the next mad thing. I read a really interesting piece by someone on the European Council for Foreign Relations, I think Agathe Desmarais, she's called, and she was saying that at the moment, Europe is struggling with which one of two roads to take. Do a deal with Trump in order to reduce tariffs or retaliate. And her thesis is that there is a third road that Europe should consider, which is to just completely ignore him. If he puts tariffs up, deal with that. If he doesn't, fine. But basically don't engage with him at all. And there is some merit to that. It's not an option, I think, for someone like the UK that finds itself adrift between the two big economic blocs. But it is an option for a bloc as big as the European Union to say, look, you do your thing, announce them one day, cancel them the next. We're just not going to participate in your soap opera.
No. The key element of that, of course, is that a bloc such as the EU, or indeed China, if it took this approach, would be taking back control. It would at least be choosing which battleground on which to engage with Trump, unlike what's been happening of late, which is where Trump opens his mouth and the battleground is already chosen for the rest of the planet.
Yeah.
So
I mean, I have to tell you that entire press conference was just mad. I mean, in a galaxy of mad press conferences by Trump, his speech earlier in the week, that rambling thing was just astonishing. Had Biden made that speech, they would have carted him off.
or there would have been the comedy shepherd's crook, and he would have been removed stage left by the neck.
It's called negotiation. You set a number. And if you go down, if I set a number at a ridiculous high number and I go down a little bit, they want me to hold that number, 145% tariff. Even I said, man, that really got up. I said, where are we now? We're at 145%. I said, whoa, that's high. That's high.
Whoa, that's high.
Just think, what is even happening? He doesn't even know what the tariffs are.
I think in some ways, in a strange way, when I saw him say that, when I heard him say that, I was always perversely reassured that he didn't seem to be cognizant of just what a mess he was making. There's something slightly easier to deal with, the idea that he is just losing it completely, rather than the idea that there is some sort of evil mastermind behind all of this, and he actually knows what he's doing.
Yeah, and that, I think, is the big difference between Trump's first term and Trump's second term. All the other things aside, the people around him, all of the inherited system of government that basically could resist a little bit the crazier things that he was attempting to do, I think there is a more fundamental shift, which is a complete acceptance from the people around him that they can't create policy. They can't consult on important decisions. They can't shape his thinking in any way in advance of anything. And so the entire machine has swung behind just hearing the latest brain fart he's released in some press event and trying to make that happen and rally around it and make it seem rational. It's a significant shift from what was happening in the first term. They're now resigned to him saying whatever, and then trying to massage that into either something else or trying to double down on it and defend it as, of course, this is the best thing ever. And you get the idea that they don't know what he will announce.
I mean, it must be dreadful to be on a Telegram or a WhatsApp group if you're in that circle and hear that notification noise. Bing! Oh dear. Oh dear, oh dear. I mean, is the last week a sign that, in terms of what we were talking about around politics, power, and punishment, is the last week a sign that the institutions, the big institutions that Trump has been taking on, are finally growing a pair?
Yeah, you're talking about the Harvard row, I take it. Yeah, it's kind of emblematic. It has become the vanguard of this fight. And I suspect that it's not a bad one. Firstly, because Harvard does have immense resources. It could easily ride out the next 4 years. It could easily ride out the next 400 years, I suspect, with zero income. Zero income from federal grants and student fees and things like that, because I'm sure that, as most very old institutions, it has all kinds of investments and land that it owns and rent that it collects, etc. So I'm sure this is only a small portion of its income, just as it is for Oxford or Cambridge or Yale. And then the second part of it is that it is an institution that does produce alumni with real loyalty.
Yeah.
And they tend to be sharp people in high positions. And so you probably have this ready-made, very effective, very dangerous network of resistance sitting behind the scenes that is ready to take Harvard's side in a more subtle way and sort of sabotage the Trump administration in various invisible ways by being a little bit slow on
Yeah,
things,
they're professionals, aren't they?
Exactly. It's both a stupid and a clever fight to take on for Trump, I think, because it's very representative of their style to just go head on with the biggest opponent in that area, But it also involves big dangers because of that.
Quiet, riot.
If you've shopped online, chances are you've bought from a business powered by Shopify. You know that purple Shop Pay button you see at checkout? The one that makes buying so incredibly easy? That's Shopify. And there's a reason so many businesses sell with it, because Shopify makes it incredibly easy to start and run your business. Shopify is the commerce platform behind 10% of all e-commerce in the US. Sign up for your $1 per month trial and start selling today at shopify.com/promo. Go to shopify.com/promo.
On that point about the sort of people that Trump's administration is taking on at Harvard, Thursday was Harvard's commencement ceremony, which had all the predictable pomp and bright young things. But we should probably remember that despite everything that's going on, there were probably families from more than 100 nations present. I mean, there were countless creeds and races. The New Yorker magazine had a very good piece on it, actually, and they talked about these creeds and races being alongside a stoically dwindling clutch of wasps whose ancestors eventually opened the university's gates to immigrants, descendants of slaves, and others different from them. The commencement speech by Harvard's Jewish president, Alan Garber, he got as far as welcome before his first standing ovation happened in a very American way. But there was another even longer ovation when he spoke to, and I quote, members of the class of 2025 from down the street, from across the country and around the world, just as it should be. There were very welcome words on a very important occasion and clearly set out Harvard's stance vis-a-vis Trump's attitude, particularly to foreign students. But as the New Yorker piece highlighted, ultimately, a government has more weapons to deploy against a university than a university has to deploy against a government. So I suppose that's a very long-winded way of saying this is a difficult fight, even for an institution as wealthy and powerful as Harvard, isn't it?
It is a big fight. It is an existential fight. However, stamina is important in this fight.
Yes.
Because there is a finite timeline to it. At best, we're looking at Trump's power being gutted in the midterms.
Yeah.
At worst, we're looking at 3 more years. And so, do I think Harvard has the stamina for this fight? Absolutely, I do. And then the second point I would make, because I read that New Yorker piece, I thought it was really good, really smart, actually, balanced. But I thought it ignored one variable, which is that institutions are not immobile. I know that there is the campus and the iconic, buildings and things like that. But if I were Bridget Phillipson, I'd be on the phone to Harvard saying, set up an annex.
Yeah.
Set up an annex over here and take all the Chinese and European students you want.
It seems to be a rhetorical war, but it's a rhetorical war that has real consequences, doesn't it? It's, it includes threats to federal research grants and student support. I mean, we should remember that foreign students bring in, I can't remember the figure, it was something like 44 billion to the US economy. So there's a huge economic impact on America as a country as well. But the whole battle echoes a broader effort by the right to recast higher education as being very much a partisan threat. Do you think we could expect to see this particular plague spread to our own shores?
I think that particular plague started on our shores, actually. I think there was a lot of stuff in the rhetoric deployed, even as far back as the coalition, that was talking about too many people are having university degrees, more people should go into apprenticeships. That was really quite classist. You never got the impression that the politician speaking meant their kids.
No.
Ever. Their kids should be allowed to go to Oxford, but your kids will probably be better off as plumbers. It really is connected to this anti-intellectualism that now runs rampant through the right wing, I think, the world over.
Yeah.
Where it stops, I don't know. I mean, my feeling is that part of it is, I guess, justified. Part of it is the losing of a constant source of cheap labor, because a society in which everyone is an architect, a society in which everyone is a lawyer or a dentist, does mean that you are taking people from somewhere else so that they can be street sweepers and posties. There is that element to it. I don't have a beef with that. My only beef is that the system should be completely meritocratic, and it's not at the moment.
No, it hasn't been for a long time.
The smartest people do not get the best opportunities. So if you want to redress the balance, then firstly, you have to make sure that you're appreciating and paying properly road sweepers and posters and care workers. That's the first thing, that those become respected professions that people want to go into. And secondly, that the system which educates others to a higher level really does choose the best others, the most apt others to be educated to that level. And I don't think that happens at the moment. So, which is what makes it just massively, massively problematic, because basically you're saying that stuff is for us and this other stuff is for you plebs.
And I mean, from a British perspective, what we were saying earlier about Harvard in particular being able to weather a very long storm because of its huge resources, that makes me deeply uneasy from a UK perspective, because in this country, a significant and disturbing number of universities are running budget deficits. And I saw some figures not that long ago that suggested that within a couple of years, the majority of universities in this country could be running budget deficits. And we've seen quite a few universities already have to make some very difficult calls around laying off staff and such like. And so our universities, some of them, like Harvard, could weather a long storm, but others, and they're the sort of universities that are quite likely to attract people from a very, very varied background, they're not in a position where they could stand up and fight for 4 years. It's not an issue that is to be taken lightly if you take the higher education sector seriously.
No, but it's a symptom of a pathology. What's happening is not the thing. The thing that happened was that education was commercialized and it began to be dictated by industry saying, we need more accountants, we need more engineers, we need more IT programmers, instead of education being appreciated as a thing that makes for better, more informed citizens. And that was because the political class, and this is not a partisan point, realized that better, more educated citizens are more difficult for a government to deal with.
That's right.
And there was a shift there. So unless someone has the bravery to stand up and say, that's not what education is for, that's what training is for. Someone who's done a degree in a dead language will have developed skills that will be hugely useful in particular positions, because their synapses work in a certain way and they can research things in a certain way and articulate things in a certain way and lead in a certain way. All they need is the training bit, which is not difficult. I read law as my first degree, and I can tell you, I remember very, very little of what went on during those many years of cramming for exams. What I do remember, however, is how to read something, how to analyze it, how to research it, and then how to express myself in response. That's the skill that doesn't go away. And I could deploy that in any industry. Indeed, I'm deploying it right now.
That's right.
Right?
Well, it's true. I mean, it's such a good point. And there are two things that I remember from my university days. The first is that I was incredibly bored by economics and politics after the first couple of years. And so what I learned to do very effectively was pass exams by doing the bare minimum of work. That turned out to be a phenomenally useful skill set. But of course, the other thing that we don't pay enough attention to sometimes is the fact that your time in higher education brings you a whole bunch of life experiences simply because it drops you into a very different environment where you're surrounded by a very different mix of people. And that is a hugely positive thing, particularly in the 21st century, in a world which is so mobile and in which you would expect to come across an awful lot more different sorts of people from different backgrounds with very different views all the time. And that life training is something that it would worry me very deeply if that particular element of higher education was threatened.
Well, listeners, for some 17 years, those of you listening from the UK at least have, in a roundabout way, owned a chunk of the NatWest Bank, courtesy of the financial crash of 2008, when Chancellor Alistair Darling spent 45 billion in old money, that's 73 billion pounds today, buying an 84% stake in the Royal Bank of Scotland, which now trades as part of the NatWest Group. The reason, well, the Royal Bank had screwed things up royally. Massive expansion, sketchy business practices, and a criminally lax approach to risk management left the bank hours from collapse when, on Monday, the 13th of October 2008, the British government announced the biggest state intervention in the private sector since World War II.
We must, in an uncertain and unstable world, be the rock of stability upon which British people can depend. This is perhaps the first government to do what I believe a large number of governments are going to do over the next few days, and it is about restoring trust and confidence in the banking system, which is absolutely essential for a successful banking system to flourish.
We don't want to be in the business of running banks. We do, and we are in the business of stabilising and strengthening banks. That's our purpose, and that's what we intend to see through.
We will do whatever it takes.
In the years that followed, the Royal Bank would be chopped up, sold in bits, and see the Royal Bank name replaced by NatWest almost everywhere except Scotland. It didn't turn a profit again until 2017, but it did become a poster child for all that was wrong with the banking sector. So when it was announced on Friday that the government had sold the last of its shares in the company, returning it to full private ownership for the first time in 16 and a half years, were we as taxpayers celebrating the end of a difficult but successful rescue mission? Kenny?
Well, no, I think is the answer. Not if you were reading the comment sections in any of the mainstream media anyway. It was quite the reverse. There was outrage. The government, having held on to the shares for 16 years, had managed to make a £10 billion loss on behalf of taxpayers. Now, as a side note, it's worth remembering that while it was rescuing RBS, the government at the time also took a stake in Lloyds Bank. That was sold back in May 2017, and that sale yielded a profit of £900 million to British taxpayers, effectively. But yeah, there are reasons for it, and far be it from me to be the person who tries to justify the fact that as taxpayers we've just had to swallow a £10 billion loss. But there are issues that it's good to be cognizant of. Apart from anything else, and I remember this from my time in Scotland at the turn of the century, RBS was an incredibly big, complicated machine. It was at one point the biggest bank on the planet, briefly. It was much more of a basket case than Lloyd's, particularly because...
much more.
Heroically a basket case in many ways. If there was one thing that RBS was particularly good at, with hindsight, it turns out being a basket case was really what they were top of the class at. It just took us rather a long time to spot what was going on. One of the biggest problems that it had was that it had a large US business arm, which was the length of which was the subject of very lengthy investigations by the Department of Justice over in the US. And so even as the government and all the experts were trying to dig RBS out of the huge hole that it found itself in, the prospect of huge fines hung over the bank for years. And it was fined £3.5 billion.
It was sinking further in, basically.
Oh, it was. It had submarined completely. And it got fined something like £3.5 billion back in 2018 for its role in the US mortgage crisis, the subprime scandal that brought down so many banks around the world. And the RBS, at the point where the government took it over, was a pretty horrible investment prospect. In 2008, it announced a loss of £24 billion. £24 billion loss in 1 year, which was, and probably still is, the biggest loss in UK corporate history. And true to form, it kept making losses every year until 2017, which is one of the reasons that successive governments have resisted the temptation to wash their hands of it, sell the shares, and be done with the whole damn thing. Share values have been depressed by these concerns, and governments have, as I say, been very reluctant to sell their stake at low prices. I think primarily because the political optics of announcing these sorts of losses in times of austerity are, to put it mildly, not good. I'm sorry we're cutting all your services. I'm sorry we're doing everything to make your lives a little bit more miserable. By the way, we've just cost you £10 billion because we've sold your shares in NatWest/RBS.
Can I say my honest reaction to doing a bit of research for the topic was that if I cast my mind back to 2009, 2010, 10 billion seems like a really cheap getaway.
Yes.
If I'm honest.
Yes.
It's like, wow, we got away with just losing 10 billion on that. That is amazing, especially amortized over a 15-year period.
Absolutely.
It's a rounding error. The second thing to say, I guess, was that the flip side of that is that it did it feels like it ushered in a new era of people expecting government intervention when things happen at big scale. In my mind, there is a direct line that you can draw between rescuing RBS and the furlough scheme during the first year of the COVID pandemic, for instance. It feels like if that had happened in 1987, everyone would have shrugged and said, well, some people will lose their job, whatever, they'll go on benefits, and then when the economy recovers, they'll get a new job. It feels like we are now in an era where the free market does not apply to things that are of such size they can basically drag the economy down with them.
Yeah, it's a very good observation. There is some irony, though, in that the rules that were introduced in the wake of the 2008 collapse were in no small part designed to minimize the risk that governments would have to intervene in a similar situation in the future by changing the rules around the amount of liquidity that banks had to hold, for example.
Yeah.
And so while the point you make about us accepting that government intervention is a thing, even what it means is in reality, taxpayers are picking up the tab for losses while shareholders in the good years pick up the profits. But the reality is that government doesn't like doing this because politically it leaves them very much out of control. At the time of the RBS collapse, Alistair Darling and Gordon Brown, the Prime Minister then, were in a very tight bind. Gordon Brown was said to have worried that he was going to have to put the soldiers onto the streets. And he took the view, quite reasonably probably, that if people can't get money out of their ATMs, and if they can't buy fuel, and if they can't buy food to feed their children, then they will just throw rocks through windows and they'll take it anyway. The idea that society is always one small disaster away from a state of absolute chaos, isn't that ridiculous? They had other reasons that made it imperative to act quickly. Not least was the fact that RBS was bigger than the entire British economy. It was literally that big. So if RBS fell over, the banking system, certainly in Britain and possibly globally, would take a huge hit and possibly fall over, even if only for a short time. And of course, over and above that, there's the idea that if the government buys shares at a real knockdown price, it sends a very poor signal to the market, and you're looking to the market to wade back in and try and help with the bailout. So it really was a perfect storm.
What we were trying to do was to say to the UK, to say to the world, the British banking system has been shored up, it is safe, it's robust, it will be functioning as normal from the next day. We only had one shot here. If the plan worked, it would be fine. If it didn't work, there was nothing else we could have done. And you do not get two shots at these things.
That's the point. They understood that this kind of intervention, it can't trickle in. It either stabilizes things or it does nothing. Brown and Darling, if this is their legacy, it is a worthwhile one. They acted entirely appropriately and in a big enough way to avoid much worse things happening down the track, and arguably demonstrated the leadership that the rest of the world then emulated, actually. Interestingly, again, while researching, I mean, I was around, I was writing about it extensively, but while looking back at this, it did actually remind me of the Ukraine situation.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that is what we did wrong in the Ukraine situation. We trickled in intervention in a way that didn't have the impact that we needed it to have. It should have been more front-loaded and bigger to send a very, very clear message to Russia, I think.
Quiet Riot. How does PwC take your company to the leading edge? They bring the sharpest minds in tech to your team, so you can bring the ideas that will transform your business. They're passionate about your industry, so you can walk into any room with every advantage. And they're with you every step of the way, so you can know you're headed in the right direction. PwC builds for what's next, so you can get there now. Get started at pwc.com/us/leading edge.
I remember in 2008, my boss at the time was Paul Dacre. I doubt very much he listens to this podcast, but at the Daily Mail, and I was at Metro at the time, and I was in his office, and door opened, and one of his secretaries came in and said, "Oh, the Chancellor is on the phone for you." And his instant reaction was, "What does that bleep want now?" In the rough and tumble of a daily newspaper, you probably do get fed up of having politicians on the phone, but there's a huge financial crisis unrolling right now, and we could all be seeing our futures put in the bin. So he said to his secretary, "Look, tell him I'll call him back in 10 minutes. And as she went to the door, he stopped her. And he said, no, hang on a second. Tell him I'll call him back in 12 minutes. The passive aggressiveness of those extra 2 minutes chilled me to the bone. It was the idea that Alistair Darling wasn't just clearly facing the biggest challenge of his professional career. It was the fact he was doing it with the dogs of Fleet Street trying to tear his legs off at the same time as well. Tell him I'll call him back in 12 minutes. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, who by some measures is the most powerful person in the country. I have no idea how Darling got through that period intact. The pressures on his shoulders must have been indescribable, absolutely indescribable. So I very much echo what you say about Brown and Darling and their experts doing a quite remarkable job in the face of something that could have absolutely cratered the British economy in ways that we can't even imagine. So there was, what do we say there was? There was 45 billion of taxpayer money went in and roughly 35 billion came out. When I was reading into this again, one of the questions I had to have answered was, where on earth did that 45 billion go? Did it all go to shareholders? Was it just a case of poor people bailing out rich people again? For those of you who are not au fait with the banking system, there were effectively two sets of beneficiaries from your 45 billion pounds. The first beneficiary was really RBS itself for things like recapitalisation and stabilising the bank. In other words, keeping the damn thing from going under completely and sucking down everything with it. And then there were indirect beneficiaries. So yes, there were existing shareholders who, thanks to the bailout, didn't see the value of their shares plummet to zero. But there were also creditors who were protected from defaults. And there was the broader financial system. The bailout mitigated knock-on effects in other institutions and stuff. So if people say, look, we bailed out, all we did was bail out rich bankers, it's not exactly the whole truth.
It's not the truth at all, actually. The money did not go in to save RBS. It went in to save the economy. And arguably, the exposure was much larger than that anyway, which is why I think when I saw the 10 billion thing, I was like, oh, that's so bad. Because at the time, what government was actually saying, and saying very directly, is that we are underwriting every bad risk that every major bank has taken. If the flow of contagion had continued, they were in for a heap of money. We're talking like, I think it was something like just under $1 trillion.
Right.
So, a lot of it basically was lost down a black hole of bad risk. A lot of bad debt had to be written out at the point where you own over 80% of an institution. And not just that, actually, the bit that had the baddest risk debt was farmed out to a separate thing that was completely owned by the government in order to sanitize the rest of the organization and make it a viable bank again. Otherwise, we wouldn't have seen profit in 2017. We would have never seen profit.
No,
the organization would have just degraded. That's not to say that, and I want to be really clear about this, as I said, I wrote about this for years. That's not to say that the poorest didn't end up paying for the terrible decisions of some people that made a lot of money out of the situation. And that arguably, if you look at Fred Goodwin's pension, are still making a very good living out of the situation. But, that's for another day, I think. The political consequences, we're still living through them, I think. That chain of events is not yet at an end. You can really, really chart side by side the rise of the far right all across Europe with austerity policies. There is not just correlation, but there is direct causation. And we are still living through that. We are still living through a period where people have lost confidence in government to do the right thing, in big institutions in general, because, Royal Bank of Scotland, despite it being private at the time, still carried that cachet of a big institution.
Yeah.
And so we are living still through that period of mistrust and cynicism. And I suspect that will take a very, very long time to filter through the system, if it ever does.
On Thursday, Shadow Justice Secretary and aspiring before and after model Robert Jenrick launched the expanded Tory universe's latest superhero.
The tapping monitor, the tapping monitor, the tapping monitor, the tapping monitor.
Fair dodges everywhere will come to dread hearing that gentle, "Excuse me, sir," just behind them. Now, Robert Jenrick would have to recover £124 each day for the next 1,000 years to pay back the $45 million that he cost taxpayers by putting through that quick property deal for a developer mate to avoid the introduction of a higher property tax. So, yin and yang, I say.
Excuse me, do you think it's all right not to pay? Seriously, why do you go back through the barrier and pay? Do you want to go back and pay like everybody else? Do you think it's all right not to pay? Why don't you go back and pay, but everyone else has to pay? You're carrying a knife, you say?
Kenny, I have a lot of thoughts about this. And we
Oh, you
don't have a lot
surprise
of
me,
time. And we don't have a lot of time. Isn't all publicity good publicity? Let me ask you as a former newspaperman.
It depends who you ask, is the answer. And actually, in this case, when I was reading and watching the video, what occurred to me was that the publicity Jenrick was getting was actually incredibly good publicity for Jenrick, let's face it. But he's the Shadow Justice Secretary, and his brief, his remit, doesn't include tackling crime, or explicitly at least, picking a fight with the London mayor. He was way off beat. So the person who I would like to ask that question of would probably be Matt Vickers, who's the Shadow Minister for Crime, Policing and Fire, the man who actually should be talking about the impact of fare evasions, as is inevitable with the Conservative Party, and with politicians in general, perhaps. The people that they're targeting turn out to be their own mates down the corridor in Westminster.
Is Jenrick getting good publicity, though? Because it seemed like such a setup, for his own former peccadillos to come through, like how much he's claimed in expenses, that deal he did, that property deal he did that cost the country over £40 billion, all of that stuff. It sort of seems like you're making your own Little Britain sketch and using yourself as a character. So yes, he's getting publicity. And yes, it is positive publicity in that he's doing something that people might back, I guess. But it also diminishes him somehow.
Look, Jenrick is good at looking like a twat, let's face it. But that doesn't mean that he's always wrong. As you highlighted, his previous twattery included helping Richard Desmond save 40 million quid. When I watched the video, I thought initially that he was out flanking Badenoch and reforming the right by targeting lawbreakers. I thought, okay, it's a change of direction. In terms of how he looked and the audience he was appealing to, for me, the key moment in that video was right at the end, where he says, he's talked about fare evaders, and then he says, it's the same with bike theft, phone theft, yep, tool theft, yes, shoplifting, drugs in town centres, weird Turkish barber shops. Hello, weird Turkish barber shops. It's literally the penultimate phrase in his video. Weird Turkish barbershops is all chipping away at society.
Yeah, that's very much a reform thing, by the way.
Completely.
The Turkish barbershops. Yeah.
Completely. And, it's what it is, of course, is yet another example of Conservative politicians further chasing that reform vote. And by the way, I think if he's going to talk about things that are chipping away at society, it's probably fair enough for us to remind him that other things that are chipping away at society include governments that have, repeatedly failed to deal with the fundamental issues such as social care, like the justice system. These are governments that have increasingly failed to convince increasing numbers of voters that they've got anything to offer what politicians condescendingly describe as ordinary voters, which is where Jenrick's message obviously lands with a big, huge social media thud. I think he's done himself no harm whatsoever with his, on the face of it, ridiculous stunt.
Yeah, I don't agree. I can't agree with that, I'm afraid. My sense is that for someone more dynamic, that looks authentic doing that, it could have worked. For someone like Jenrick, whose defining quality, in my view, is flaccidity. Do you know what I mean?
I know exactly what you mean.
He's not an action man. He's a curtain twitcher. And in my mind, this just enhances that flaccid curtain twitcher persona.
I'm getting that put in a t-shirt.
He's going up to largely young people who make fuck all money, live in a city that overcharges them rent, has all kinds of problems that his government caused, and going up to them and diminishing himself to become a sort of petty vigilante. And this ties straight into with his painting over the Mickey Mouse murals. And, and so he's someone who already has a reputation as a mean, petty, small man. And so while I do think that for someone else it could have worked, I think for him it's a disaster because it completely cements his reputation as a petty, mean, small man.
Quiet Riot.
This episode is brought to you by GM Genuine Parts and AC Delco. Get the most out of your vehicle with GM Genuine Parts and AC Delco original equipment. The only parts designed, engineered, tested, and backed by General Motors. You can find your perfect fit for most makes and models and choose from 3 tiers of parts, including GM OE or gold and silver aftermarket parts. Visit gmparts.com for more information.
Quiet Riot.
That somebody who might have been able to pull it off in his own buffoonish way might have been Boris Johnson. But if we think back, the big nail, certainly one of the biggest nail in Johnson's prime ministerial coffin, was when he broke lockdown rules, which he'd introduced and which most of us, including the dearly departed Queen, obeyed. I think that Jenrick might have, perhaps accidentally, wandered into an area where he's actually nailing something that resonates with the public.
I think that's completely true and completely fair. I think those petty everyday annoyances, they have cut through. As you know, I use my other half as my monitor of what is having cut through and what isn't. And it's interesting that the last 2 times we've gone out in London, he's noticed and complained about people coming very close to us to pass through their barriers when we tap in, basically. And so I do think it's something that has cut through. I do think it's something that does annoy people. As you know very well, the primary obstacle for any politician is name recognition. And so I think this won't hurt him on this. A lot of people will become aware of him that weren't necessarily aware of him before. And all of that helps. All of that helps him up to a point. And then comes the critical poll in every single election that asks the public, do you see this person as prime minister? And this kind of stunt makes the answer no. So all of what you say is absolutely true, but none of it helps him personally get to where he ultimately wants to get. And I wonder whether this is actually a shift of strategy, because what I wanted to ask you is this actually aimed at Badenoch and the Tory leadership, or is he launching a London mayoral campaign?
Well, actually, that was my first thought after I watched the video initially. Why is he having a pop? Why is a shadow justice minister having a pop at the London mayor? Why is he punching down politically this way? You don't pick fights with people who are your political inferiors, if you like.
Well, Trump did it.
Trump punches down everything, doesn't he? Yeah.
Yeah, but come on, the president of the United States punching down on the London mayor was quite a difference in size, right?
We know 2 things. We know that Jenrick we know lots of things about Jenrick. He's very ambitious. He wants to be leader of the Conservative Party. And with this sort of stunt, he's made that he's got an issue here that he can make his own, that he can build headlines around. And I think, particularly from a mayoral perspective, he's got an issue that has very close proximity to the voting public. The idea of proximity in stories is incredibly important. It's something that I take from my years in newspapers. The closer you are to a story, the more important it is. That's why if a bus falls into a ravine in India and 70 people die, we don't read about it here. But if the local butcher's gets robbed by a dog, you're going, yeah, we want to read about that. And there are different sorts of proximity. One of them is political proximity, which is one of the things he appears to be doing here. But the other is literal proximity to these crimes. We're going through the barriers, we're paying our fares, but these people aren't. And I see it every day, and I'm obeying the rules, and I look stupid because of it. So if he is preparing a bid for the London mayorship, and I've worked with London mayoral candidates before, I have to say that taking on an issue like fare evasion on the underground is something that will strike a chord with a great many people. And
I agree.
We will stop them worrying quite so much about how much of a jerk he's been over the last 10 years.
it's a much smaller position than Prime Minister. So the objection I had, if this is part of a Tory leadership bid, does not apply to this. So I think the two are entirely conciliable. If this is his opening bid for a London mayoral campaign, it's very smart. If this is his opening bid at another go at the Tory leadership, I think it's disastrous. I think he will end up standing on a stage next to someone like Cleverly, and he will just look like a cartoon character.
So one final question into you as the clock runs down, Alex. With that in mind, why on earth have our politics, and probably Tory politicians in particular, become so small?
Yeah, I can see Margaret Thatcher as in Sunset Boulevard going, "It's not me that got too big, it's our politics that got small." I think it probably goes back to the global financial crisis, you know.
Right.
I think it was that moment that meant basically the Conservative Party had been gutted ideologically from the inside, because they had to support a situation where the free market didn't work. The lower regulation that they had argued and lobbied for turned out to be a disaster. And government had to step in and save a company that, as we discussed, deserved to fail. RBS deserved to fail, but it wasn't allowed to because of the wider repercussions that would have. That is a really deep wound in the philosophy of the invisible hand and the free market unfettered sort itself out. And I don't think they ever recovered from that. And so lacking that central ideological backbone that says it's all about the free market and the small state, they had to then revert to gimmicks like this in order to get the sugar high of popularity without actually having any plan of what they might do if they get there. And that's been a consistent feature, really, I would say, since Cameron. Cameron wanted to be Prime Minister because he thought he'd be good at it. He didn't want to be Prime Minister because he had any particular program that he wanted to implement. Same with Johnson, same with Truss, same with Sunak. And so that's been the pattern for the Conservative Party. It has become such a corporatized institution. It's become such a mirror of an organization like a bank that the promotion is sought after just because you want to be promoted within the outfit, not because you think you could do good for the country if you were in that position. And the result has been that, as we see in many, many companies, and as we were talking about RBS, right to the top, sometimes the more sociopathic people get promoted. The people who are good at lying and making themselves look good get promoted, not the people who are competent and have the skills to do a good job.
Haven't you wrapped up our various discussions in one neat ball right there? Well done, Alex.
Is that good? Was that good?
That was very good, and off the cuff as well.
So that's it for this week's Sunday School. Good to see that we run even longer with a timekeeper as panel. Lovely to have you, Kenny.
Lovely to be here, despite having to get up at an ungodly hour this morning. Thank you, listeners, for lending us your ears once more. Don't forget to like, subscribe, leave reviews, share episodes, and of course, support us at ko-fi.com/QuiteRightPod if you can.
We'll be back on Thursday, so in the meantime, please enjoy the rest of your weekend and don't forget how much we really, really love you.
See ya!
Bye!
Quite Right is an audio production by Cooler Heads with Naomi Smith and Alex Andreou. Produced by Kenny Campbell. Music by Mariana Sangeeta. Artwork by Simona Canelu. And edited by me, Alex Reese. Quiet Riot is a co-production with Sandstone Global.
Quiet Riot.
London 2025, a city in anarchy. High rents, petty crime, low traffic neighborhoods, bad sushi, unreasonably expensive but delicious cinnamon buns, fare dodging, and weird Turkish barber shops. In this place of lawlessness, a new hero will rise. One man will stand for justice.
One man will refuse to accept a short back and sides, all done with clippers. One man will say,
Seriously, why do you go back through the barrier and pay?
The Tapping Monitor, coming June 23rd.